One heresy that I've always found interesting is that of Josephinism. Josephinism is named for the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, who ruled from 1765 to 1790, roughly coinciding with the tail end of the Enlightenment and the early revolutionary period of American history. Though raised in the Catholic faith by his pious mother, Empress Maria Theresa, Joseph was heavily influenced by Jansenism and by the writings of Voltaire, both of which were critical of Baroque piety. An admirer of so called enlightened despots, such as Prussia's Frederick the Great, Joseph believed that the church's massive institutional infrastructure should be reoriented towards more socially constructive purposes. With over 2,100 monasteries and 45,000 religious in just the Habsburg lands alone, Joseph was frustrated that all this manpower was wasted on purely spiritual pursuits. He held the contemplative orders in particular disdain for what he called their uselessness. What benefits the church could confer upon the country if its vast resources were employed in civil service? What grand things could be accomplished if the wealth of the monasteries was employed in providing for the material needs of the people? Looking out at the broad sea of religious houses that dotted his kingdom from one end to the other, Joseph said, "Could not this have been sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Joseph therefore embarked upon a project of reform aimed at redirecting the church's resources towards more socially useful purposes, in conformity with the emperor's enlightened vision. His reforms would aim to reduce the number of useless monks and nuns and increase the number of useful priests, whom Joseph referred to as civil servants in a black cassock. On January 12th, 1782, Joseph issued his decree of the dissolution of religious orders. This decree began dissolving purely contemplative religious houses which had, quote, no school, did not care for the sick, did not preach or hear confessions, or distinguish themselves in the schools. This decree disproportionately affected women's orders, since female orders were much likelier to practice strict enclosure. This enlightened monarch thus eliminated one of the only avenues available at the time for unmarried women to establish themselves. So progressive. The second phase of closures came in 1783. Known as the Klostersturm, this wave of closures lasted for 5 years and shuttered around 800 religious houses. The orders were dissolved, the religious turned out, and their buildings either demolished or converted into hospitals, poorhouses, barracks, and factories. Pius VI, horrified at that emperor's actions, came to Vienna in person to meet Joseph and beg him to stop. Joseph listened to the Pope's pleas patiently, and when he departed, Joseph escorted the Pope to the monastery of Maria Brunn, placated him with a goodbye present, then shut down the monastery as soon as the Pope was out of sight. A third wave of dissolutions followed that closed an additional 400 houses, but ended in 1791 shortly after the emperor's death. Though implemented throughout the empire, Joseph's closures were felt heaviest in the lands of the Habsburg monarchy, those imperial territories under direct Habsburg rule. All in all, half of Austria's religious houses were closed. Not a single contemplative order was left in the lands of the Habsburg monarchy. While Joseph's actions obviously call to mind the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, Joseph's closures were notably different. Of course, Henry's closures affected all monasteries indiscriminately, whereas Joseph's targeted only contemplative houses. But more importantly, while Henry simply appropriated the wealth of the monasteries to fund his government, Joseph invested it back into the church, albeit under a more worldly vision directed towards more useful endeavors. The money was used to create 3,000 new parishes, largely in the growing city suburbs, but also throughout the countryside. Furthermore, Catholic institutes engaging in charitable work, such as hospitals, schools, and poorhouses, were subsidized, and religious who were turned out of their houses and had nowhere else to go were paid off out of a religious fund. Josephinism was thus not simple anti clericalism or anti monasticism, it was an entire suite of ideas. Preference for the secular clergy over the religious, for the pragmatic over the speculative, for the corporal works of mercy over the spiritual, for the active over the contemplative, for the view of the clergy as glorified social workers, and all marinated in a general philosophy of utilitarianism. It was, in essence, an inversion of the hierarchy of goods, whereby the supernatural is subordinated to the natural. Josephinism is thus a precursor to the liberation theology of the 20th century, wherein the salvation wrought by Christ only has value insofar as it is expressed through socioeconomic initiatives whose results can be measured by the same empirical metrics used when evaluating any other secular social program. While the monastic closures ended with the death of Joseph II, this set of ideas lives on in the church today. In fact, I'd say we are living in a period of Josephinism resurgent, where this is the default worldview shared by a fair amount of Catholic prelates and theologians. The seemingly limitless faith in work sessions, committees, and programs, the bureaucratization of spirituality, the endless obsessing over social justice, rights, and representation, missionaries who are more interested in building infrastructure than building the kingdom, the constant talk of peripheries, inclusion, and accompaniment, the pervasive dream that a utopian age of universal brotherhood is about to be ushered in if we could just leverage the church's resources for societal change. Today, I'd say this goes by the name synodality, but really it's just a 21st century manifestation of Josephinism as it exhibits the same underlying tendency to subordinate the supernatural to the natural. Now, don't get me wrong, a healthy church does result in positive socioeconomic outcomes, but there has to be a proper ordering of values. As C.S. Lewis observed, if you seek heaven first, you get earth thrown in as a consolation prize. But if you seek earth first, you get neither earth nor heaven. The healing of society requires a culture that prioritizes transcendent values because only transcendent values can actually elevate a culture. This is why renewal always comes back to holiness, to personal conversion, and to prayer. Josephinism seems to think that it can remove the speck in society's eye without dealing with the plank in its own. Similarly, synodality offers us a merely bureaucratic solution to society's problems without the spiritual renewal that can only come from prayer, mortification, and holiness. One holy person in a parish would do more for that congregation than 10 action committees. While there's a lot we could criticize about the recent Eucharistic revival, the one thing they did right was choose to focus on Eucharistic adoration and Eucharistic devotions. This decision evidences that, whatever their other faults, the Catholic bishops of the United States were still collectively smart enough to recognize the primacy of the supernatural, and that all meaningful change within the church must start there. I think this is also the sentiment behind the traditionalist movement, the conviction that our relationship to God must come first, and that this divine priority should be reflected in our worship. Josephinism is no less wrongheaded today than it was in the 1780s, no matter what new packaging and marketing gimmicks it adopts. If you want to learn more about Josephinism, there's a great article called Josephinism in Austria by Scott Berg that I've linked in the description. If you want something more concise and you have a copy of it, there's a tidy summary of the Josephine reforms in the fifth chapter of Archduke Edward Habsburg's book, The Habsburg Way, from Sophia Press. Or alternately, the World of the Habsburgs website has a nice little article called The Question of Utility by Martin Muchlechner, link also in the description. Those interested in understanding Josephinism in the context of the overall Habsburg political program should consult the book The Rise and Fall of the Habsburg Monarchy by Victor Tapier, which is a dense and long but very informative book that has a substantial analysis of the Josephine reforms. Hey, before you go, I want to take a minute to tell you about the St. John Ogilvie prayer book. It's always disgusted me how contemporary Celtic spirituality is so infused with New Age gobbledygook when there's such a rich heritage of Catholic tradition in the Celtic world. It is to redress this problem that I've published the St. John Ogilvie Prayer Book, a collection of prayers and blessings in the Celtic tradition that are solidly Catholic. Compiled by Dr. Joe Johnson and featuring an introduction by none other than the great Archbishop Athanasius Schneider, this prayer book features prayers in English, Latin, and Scots Gaelic. All of the Church's regular universal texts are included, along with traditional Catholic Scotch-Irish prayers. There are daily prayers for morning and evening, blessings and invocations for all sorts of events, seasonal prayers, and litanies reflecting the saints of Ireland and Scotland. Bound in high-quality leatherette with thin gilded pages and ribbon, the St. John Ogilvie Prayer Book will make a beautiful addition to your treasury of spiritual reading, especially if you are one of the millions of Catholics who have Scotch-Irish blood in your veins. They can be purchased on the Cruachan Hill website, link in the description, and if you use the promo code UNAM at checkout, you can get 15% off. The books are ready to ship and would make a lovely Christmas gift. So click the link below and get your copy of the St. John Ogilvie Prayer Book today.